She stepped off that stagecoach weighing 240 pounds, wearing a dress that didn't quite fit right, carrying a single trunk, and no one waiting to greet her. And the whole town of Red Hollow stopped what they were doing just to laugh. They'd heard a mail-order bride was coming for Rhett Callahan. They just hadn't expected this. What happened next would shake that town down to its foundation. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like and follow so you don't miss a single part. The stagecoach from Abilene ran 2 hours late, which gave the people of Red Hollow more than enough time to gather. It wasn't planned exactly. Word had a way of moving fast through a town that size, a few hundred souls packed into a strip of dry land between the creek and the cattle trail, where there wasn't much to do on a Tuesday afternoon besides mind everyone else's business. Someone at the telegraph office had mentioned it to someone at the feed store, who told the barber, who told the men waiting in his chairs, and by the time the stagecoach finally rolled down the main street trailing a rooster tail of dust, there were maybe 30 people standing on the boardwalk outside the general store, not pretending to be doing anything else. They were waiting to see Rhett Callahan's mail-order bride. The coach creaked to a stop in front of Haggerty's Dry Goods. The driver climbed down slow, like his back hurt, and unhitched the luggage from the rack without any particular sense of occasion. There were 2 other passengers, a drummer with a sample case and an older man in a wool suit who looked like a lawyer, and they stepped down first, squinting into the afternoon glare. Then the door opened again. Clara Whitmore came down those steps carefully, one hand on the rail, because the bottom step was loose and she'd felt it wobble under the drummer's weight, and she wasn't going to give anybody the satisfaction of watching her fall. She was 29 years old, and she'd been traveling for 4 days straight from Springfield, Missouri, sleeping upright in a coach seat, eating dried biscuits and whatever she could buy at way stations, and she was tired in the particular way that gets into your bones after a while and makes everything feel slightly removed, like you're watching the world from behind glass. She was a big woman. That was the fact of it, and she'd stopped trying to dress around it years ago. Her traveling dress was dark blue wool, practical, a little worn at the elbows. Her hair was brown and pinned up under a hat that had seen better days. She carried a small bag in one hand, and she looked around the street with the careful attention of someone arriving somewhere unfamiliar and trying to get her bearings. The laughter started almost immediately, not loud, not all at once. It began as something quieter, a few snorts, a muttered comment, the kind of sound that a crowd makes when it's thinking the same thing and someone finally gives it permission. Clara heard it. She'd been hearing variations of that sound her whole life, and she recognized it the way you recognize a smell that brings back a memory you'd rather forget. She kept her face neutral and looked for the man she was supposed to meet. Rhett Callahan wasn't there. That was the first problem. He'd said in his letter that he would meet the coach himself, or if ranch business prevented it, he'd send his foreman, a man named Walt Briggs. Clara scanned the faces on the boardwalk. Curious faces, amused faces, a few that had the decency to look away when she caught them staring, and didn't see anyone who looked like they were there for her. "Lord have mercy," a woman said, not quietly enough. "That's what he sent for?" Clara turned toward the voice. It belonged to a woman about her own age, maybe a few years younger, wearing a yellow dress that probably cost more than Clara's trunk and everything in it. She was standing with 2 other women, and they were all looking at Clara with the particular expression that certain women learn early, that look that isn't quite cruelty, but lives right next door to it. "Reckon the photograph didn't capture the full picture," one of the other women said, and the 3 of them laughed together. "Must have been a painting," said the third, "and a generous one at that." Clara turned away. She had done this enough times that she knew the math of it. Engaging only made it worse, gave them more to work with, extended the whole miserable performance. She walked to the luggage rack where the driver had put her trunk, a battered thing with brass corners that had belonged to her mother, and she stood beside it and waited. A man in a leather apron came out of the dry goods store and leaned against the doorframe. "You the Callahan woman?" "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm here to meet Rhett Callahan. He's out at the ranch." The man scratched the back of his neck. "Sent a boy in this morning to say there was fence trouble out on the east pasture. Said to tell you he'd send someone." "And did someone come?" The man looked around vaguely, as if the answer might be standing somewhere nearby. "Suppose not." From the boardwalk, a man's voice called out, Maybe he changed his mind when he saw what was coming. That got a bigger laugh, wider, less careful. Clara picked up her small bag and looked at the man in the apron. Is there somewhere I can wait out of the sun? He let her sit in the store. It smelled like tobacco and lamp oil and the particular dusty sweetness of dried beans stored in big barrels, and it was blessedly cool after the heat outside. Clara sat on a wooden chair near the back and drank a cup of water the man's wife brought her without being asked. The wife didn't laugh, just looked at Clara with something that might have been sympathy or might have been curiosity, and said the ride from Abilene was brutal in this heat, wasn't it? It was, Clara agreed. Thank you for the water. She waited an hour and a half. She used the time to think, which was something she was good at. She'd had a lot of practice. Growing up in Springfield with a widowed mother who took in laundry, Clara had learned early that the world wasn't going to make space for her. Not her size, not her circumstances, not the particular combination of things that made her who she was. What she'd learned instead was how to look at a problem until she understood its shape, and then figure out what leverage she had. She had some. Not much, but some. Rhett Callahan had written to her through the matrimonial agency in Springfield 7 months ago. His letter had been straightforward to the point of bluntness. He needed a wife who could help manage a working ranch. He wasn't interested in pretense or performance. He had decent land and a troubled financial situation, and he was 34 years old and hadn't the time or the inclination for courtship in the conventional sense. He described himself as practical and occasionally difficult, and not much for talking about feelings. He'd asked for the same in return. Clara had written back. Her letter had been equally direct. She'd described her experience, keeping her mother's household accounts from the time she was 12, managing the laundry business after her mother's health declined, nursing that business through 2 bad winters. She'd described what she could offer and what she expected in return. She hadn't mentioned her size because she hadn't seen the relevance. The agency had forwarded a photograph, the same way it forwarded photographs of everyone. They'd exchanged 4 more letters before he'd sent the stage fare and the date. She'd read those letters enough times that she had them close to memorized. He wasn't warm exactly, but he was honest in a way she'd found more reassuring than warmth. He'd written, "The ranch is in worse shape than I'd like to admit to most people. We lost half the herd to fever 2 years back and haven't fully recovered. The drought has made the past 2 seasons thin. I won't pretend otherwise." She'd respected that. She'd written back, "I've managed on thin before. It's not comfortable, but it teaches you things plenty." He'd responded, "That's the kind of answer I was hoping for." So she waited. She reviewed what she knew. She tried not to think about the laughter outside. The man who finally came for her wasn't the foreman. He was a boy, really, maybe 16, with a sunburned nose and the look of someone who'd ridden hard and wasn't happy about it. He came into the store, looked at Clara, looked at the storekeeper's wife, and said, "You the one for Blackthorn Ranch?" "I am." "I got the wagon outside." He paused, something working behind his expression. "Sorry you had to wait." The ride to Blackthorn Ranch took 45 minutes on a road that wasn't much more than 2 ruts worn into the dry grass. The boy's name was Danny, and he worked the ranch part-time after school. He didn't say much, but he wasn't unkind either. He'd loaded her trunk into the wagon bed without being asked, and he drove carefully over the rough patches, which she appreciated. The land was harder than she'd expected. She'd grown up in Missouri, where things were greener, where the hills had a softness to them, even in dry summers. This was different. Big sky pressing down on flat brown country, grass that had gone yellow-gray in the drought, fence lines stretching to the horizon like sentences that wouldn't end. It had a kind of beauty, she supposed, if you could get past the harshness of it. Or maybe the beauty was the harshness. She wasn't sure yet. She was still deciding when they came over a low rise and she saw the ranch. Blackthorn Ranch was not what she'd pictured. The main house was a 2-story frame building that had been white once and was now the color of old cream, with a porch that sagged on one end and window shutters that had come loose and been rehung slightly wrong. Behind it were a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings in varying states of repair, and 4 corrals. The corrals were mostly empty. There was a windmill that turned slow in the thin afternoon breeze, and a water tank below it that showed its rust from 50 yards out. It looked like a place that had been fighting something for a long time. There were men in the yard, 3 of them near the barn, and they stopped what they were doing and looked at the wagon as it came in through the gate. Clara saw the moment they registered her, the small adjustment in posture, the exchange of glances. Not laughter, not quite. Something more like recalculation. Danny pulled up in front of the house and set the brake. "Mr. Callahan should be back in directly," he said. "He was out east fence most of the day." Clara climbed down from the wagon without help, which wasn't easy but wasn't as hard as the step on the stagecoach. She stood in the yard and looked at the house, and the house looked back at her, and she thought, well, this is what we have to work with. One of the men near the barn came over. He was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, with a gray mustache and the deliberate walk of someone whose knees had been giving him trouble for years. Miss Whitmore?" "Claire's fine." "Walt Briggs. I'm the foreman." He shook her hand, which she appreciated. "Red'll be along shortly. Fence situation took longer than expected. You can come inside if you want. Dorothy left some things in the kitchen." "Dorothy?" "Woman who used to help with the house. She moved on to her daughter's place in Tucson 3 months back." He paused. "Hasn't really been replaced." Clara took note of this. "I'm fine waiting out here," she said. "I've been sitting long enough." Briggs nodded and went back to what he'd been doing, which seemed to involve looking at a wagon wheel and frowning at it. The other 2 men drifted back to their work. Danny started unloading her trunk. She stood in the yard and looked around. Really looked. The way she looked at problems. The sagging porch would need new supports before winter. The brace posts were rotting at the base. The windmill needed oil, probably. It was turning unevenly, stuttering slightly on every 3rd rotation. The water tank had a slow leak somewhere along the bottom seam, judging by the dark stain in the dirt below the drain. The barn doors were hung crooked. The fence line visible from the yard had 2 sections of wire that were loose enough to see from here. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was the kind of deferred maintenance that accumulated when a place didn't have enough hands and money had been too tight to stay ahead of it. She heard a horse coming before she saw it. He came in through the east gate at a working trot, pulled up short when he saw the wagon in the yard, and dismounted in the manner of someone who'd been doing it for so long it happened without thought. He was taller than she'd expected, over 6 feet, lean in the way working men get lean, not shaped by effort but reduced to it, everything unnecessary burned off by years of physical work. His face was weathered, and he hadn't shaved in a few days, and his shirt had a long tear along one shoulder that had been stitched up with the wrong color thread. He saw her and stopped. She watched him take her in. She'd gotten good at reading those moments, the quick assessment, the micro-adjustment of expectation. His face didn't do what the townspeople's faces had done. It didn't do much of anything, in fact, which was its own kind of thing to navigate. He walked toward her. "Miss Whitmore?" "Mr. Callahan." He stopped about 4 feet away and looked at her steadily. His eyes were gray-green, she thought, or maybe just gray in this light. "I apologize for not meeting the stage. Fence came down overnight and we had cattle getting into the Henderson pasture." Your foreman explained. A pause. "I expected you yesterday." "Coach ran a day late out of Abilene. Didn't you get the telegram?" "Telegraph's been unreliable since the storm last week." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that reminded her, unexpectedly, of her father. "You've been waiting." "I've been looking around," she said. Something shifted in his expression barely. "And?" "Your windmill needs oil. You've got a seam leak on that water tank, low on the south side. The porch, the left front support is rotting through. Not an emergency, but it will be by spring if it doesn't get attention." Rhett Callahan was quiet for a moment, then, "You got all that standing in the yard?" "I've been here 20 minutes. He looked at her for another beat. Then he turned toward the barn and called, "Danny, get the tack sorted before you go." He turned back to Clara. "Come inside. You must be hungry." The kitchen was in a state that Clara chose to describe to herself, privately, as honest. Dishes had been washed but not put away. There was a coffee pot on the stove with old coffee in it, which she poured out and rinsed without being asked. A side of salt pork hung from a hook near the back door. There were eggs in a ceramic bowl on the table, fresh ones by the look of them, and a sack of flour and some cornmeal and a half wheel of hard cheese. Rhett came in from the back, where he'd presumably washed up, and sat at the kitchen table. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd just made. She'd found the grounds in a tin above the stove, and watched her move around the kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I'm doing it because I'm hungry, and making enough for 2 takes the same effort as making enough for 1. She found a skillet, found the lard, found enough onion to make the salt pork worth eating. "I can stop if it bothers you." "It doesn't bother me." She cooked. He drank his coffee. The kitchen filled with the smell of pork fat and onion and something almost like the suggestion of normalcy, which felt strange given the circumstances, but not unwelcome. "Town treated you rough," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara kept her eyes on the skillet. "They were entertained. I heard there's a group that likes to make a sport of things." He paused. "I'm sorry. If I'd been there." "You'd have done what? Told them to stop?" She glanced at him. "That doesn't generally work." His jaw tightened. "No," he allowed. "I suppose not." She put the food on the table and sat across from him. They ate for a minute without talking, which wasn't awkward exactly. It was the quiet of 2 people who'd both grown up knowing that conversation required more energy than silence, and was therefore reserved for when it mattered. "I need to say something," Rhett said. "Go ahead." "I know this isn't what you pictured." He was looking at his plate. "The ranch is in worse shape than my last letter suggested. I thought things were turning around, and then the drought ran long, and I lost another dozen head in the spring to a bad waterhole situation. We're short-handed because I can't pay decent wages right now. And the neighbors—" He stopped. "The neighbors," Clara prompted. "There are 3 ranchers in this valley who've been wanting my land for a while. The Greer brothers and a man named Aldous Hatch. They've been buying up smaller operations when they go under. They've made it clear they'd like mine to be next." He looked up at her then. "I'm telling you this now because it's going to affect your life here, and you deserve to know what you walked into." Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the windmill stuttered through its uneven rotation. One of the horses in the corral whinnied, and another answered. "In your 3rd letter," she said, "you wrote that you needed someone who wasn't afraid of hard." "I did." "I'm not afraid of hard." She picked up her fork. "I'm afraid of being lied to about what kind of hard it is, so I appreciate you telling me." Something loosened in his face, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. "Fair enough," he said. There was no ceremony. They'd agreed on that in the letters. They would go to the county seat, sign the paperwork, and that would be the practical reality of it. Love and friendship and all of that were things that could be built over time, or not built at all. And both of them seemed to understand this was an arrangement before it was anything else. What they hadn't accounted for was that living alongside someone has a way of turning practical arrangements into something harder to categorize. The first week, Clara made herself useful in the way she'd learned to make herself useful, not by asking permission, but by looking at what needed doing and doing it. She found the household accounts, which were kept in a battered ledger in the bottom drawer of the desk in Rhett's office, and she sat with them for 2 evenings until she understood where the money was going. She inventoried the root cellar and the smokehouse and the grain store in the barn. She learned the ranch's rhythms, what time the men came in, what time the animals needed tending, where the trouble spots were. On the 4th day, she asked Walt Briggs to walk the fence lines with her. Briggs was wary of her at first, in the watchful way of a man who'd been at a place a long time and wasn't sure what a new person was going to change. But he was also practical, and when she started asking questions that were clearly informed by the ledger and the inventory, his wariness shifted into something more like cautious respect. "The east fence keeps going down," she said. They were standing at the section that had given trouble the morning she arrived. The repair was already starting to sag. "What's wrong with it?" "Ground's soft out here. Posts don't hold well in dry season, and then when it rains, which it ain't done in a while, the soil shifts. So the posts need to go deeper. They need to be longer. We've been using what we have." "What would longer posts cost?" Briggs looked at her sideways. "You planning to buy fence posts?" "I'm planning to understand why the same fence keeps going down every week, and whether there's a fix that costs less than the time your men spend repairing it." She looked at him. "Is that an unusual question?" "No, ma'am." He paused. Nobody's asked it before is all. She did the math that evening. Longer posts would cost more up front, about $12 for the full East Line, but would save roughly 20 hours of labor per month at the rate the fence was failing. At Rhett's current wage situation, 20 hours was worth more than $12. She wrote it up and put it on his desk. He didn't say anything about it until 2 days later, when he came in from the evening check and found her at the kitchen table with the household ledger and a second ledger she'd started keeping herself. "You found the fence post calculation," he said. "I left it for you, yes." He sat down across from her. He had that look again, the one she was starting to recognize, the one where something was happening behind his expression that he hadn't decided whether to let out yet. "Where'd you learn to do that? The math on labor versus materials?" "My mother's laundry business." She didn't look up from the ledger. "We had to decide every season whether to replace equipment or keep repairing it. Wrong decision either way costs you." "You ran that business?" "After her health went, mostly. For about 6 years." She made a note in the margin. "She died 3 winters ago." Rhett was quiet. "I'm sorry." "It was hard." Clara looked up then. "She was the only person in my life who thought I was capable of things, so it was hard in more ways than one." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before she'd thought it through, which wasn't like her, and she looked back down at the ledger to signal that the topic was closed. But Rhett didn't let it close. "She was right," he said. Clara kept her eyes on the page. "You've known me 9 days. The fence post thing is smart. The inventory is smarter. You found 3 things we were running low on before I would have noticed. And you talked to old Hank Pruitt in the bunkhouse for an hour yesterday about the Westwater situation. And he told me afterward you understood the problem better after an hour than most of the hands do after a year." He paused. 9 days is enough time to see that." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she had an answer that wouldn't come out wrong. The trouble with towns is that they notice things. What Red Hollow noticed over the first few weeks of Clara's presence at Blackthorn Ranch was that things seemed to be going differently than expected. The hands stopped having that aimless midday drift that happened when direction was unclear. Small repairs got done that had been left undone for months. The ranch itself seemed, to people passing on the road, less like a place barely holding on and more like a place that had decided to keep going. This was not universally celebrated. Mabel Greer, wife of the older Greer brother, Owen, noticed it first. Mabel had been raised in a family that believed in knowing everything about everyone in a 10-mile radius, and she had refined this into something close to an art form. She noticed that Blackthorn Ranch's fence line was in better repair than it had been in 2 years. She noticed that Walt Briggs, who sometimes came into town for supplies and could usually be drawn into an indirect conversation about ranch difficulties, now deflected those conversations with a mild pleasantness that said he'd been told to. She noticed that Rhett Callahan, who had taken on a look of chronic worry over the past 2 years, seemed slightly less like a man counting down to a foreclosure. She brought these observations to Owen. Owen Greer was 61 years old, thick through the middle, and had built his operation through a combination of good land judgment and a willingness to step hard on anything in his path. His brother Cal handled the rough edges of things, which Owen preferred not to think about in detail. What Owen cared about was outcomes. "Callahan's wife," Mabel said. "What about her?" "She's not what anyone expected." Owen shrugged. "She's fat and she's plain and she came off a mail order list. She's not going to save that ranch." "Maybe not," Mabel said. "But she's already changed things. I can see it from the road." Owen was quiet for a moment. "She'll fail. They always do." "Owen," Mabel looked at him steadily. "You should make sure she does." Aldous Hatch came to the same conclusion from a different direction. Hatch was younger than the Greers, 43, with a precise and careful manner that some people mistook for intelligence and was actually something colder and more functional. The ability to look at a situation and identify exactly what needed to be true for it to work in his favor, and then work backward from there. He'd been watching Callahan's financial situation for 2 years. He'd expected the drought to finish the job. Instead, there were reports of small improvements, of reorganized operations, of a woman from Missouri who apparently had ideas and wasn't shy about using them. Hatch sat with this information and thought about it carefully. Then he sent a message to Owen Greer, and they met at the saloon in Red Hollow on a Thursday afternoon when neither of them had any reason to be in town. Claire didn't know about that meeting. There was a lot she didn't know yet. What she knew was that the drought was worse than Rhett had let on in his letters. The water situation was genuinely serious. The creek that fed the main tank had dropped by 2/3 over the summer, and they were managing it carefully, rotating cattle between pastures to keep the grazing even and the water demand spread out. But there were two things working against them. The well in the north pasture had a sulfur problem that made the water unpalatable to the cattle, and the eastern fence kept letting cows drift onto Henderson land, where the grass was marginally better and the water source was a small pond that Henderson himself was using carefully. Henderson wasn't an enemy. He was just a neighbor with his own problems and a finite patience for blackthorn cattle showing up in his pasture. Clara went to see him. She didn't ask Rhett's permission. She thought about it, decided the conversation was more likely to go well if it was her having it than if it was Rhett. There was a history there, she'd gathered, some tension over a property line dispute from 4 years back that had technically been resolved but left a residue. And she hitched up the wagon and drove herself the 4 miles to Henderson's place on a Wednesday morning. Tom Henderson was a spare, quiet man in his mid-40s who looked at her with the cautious curiosity of someone who'd heard things and wasn't sure how much of it to credit. He was mending harness in the yard when she pulled up, and he didn't put it down. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Clara's fine." She climbed down from the wagon. "I'm here about the fence." "I figured. I want to propose a solution. Can I take 10 minutes of your time?" Henderson set down the harness. "Go ahead." She'd thought it through the night before, sitting at the table after Rhett had gone to bed. The east fence was part of the problem, but the actual problem was water distribution. If she could solve the sulfur issue in the north well, she could keep the cattle away from the east fence line altogether during the dry months, which meant Henderson's pasture stayed clear and the fence repairs stopped eating their labor budget. The sulfur solution wasn't complicated. She'd read about it. There was a method using charcoal filtration that could reduce sulfur content enough to make the water acceptable to cattle. It required some materials and a few days of work, but it wasn't expensive. "We fixed the north well. Our cattle stopped drifting," she said. "That's better for both of us. And if we fix it before winter, we're in a better position for next spring regardless of what the drought does." Henderson was quiet for a moment. "Rhett know you're here? He knows I was thinking about it." This was approximately true. She'd mentioned the well situation at dinner, and Rhett had said it was worth looking at, which she'd interpreted as the kind of implicit authorization you took when you needed to. Henderson looked at her for a long moment. "You're different from what they're saying in town." "I expect so." "They're saying you're—" He paused, choosing, "that you're going to be gone inside a year." "People have said things like that about me before. Have they been right?" "Not yet," Clara said. Henderson almost smiled. "That well fix. It'd work on my north line, too. I've got a sulfur issue in my second pasture. I'd be glad to walk you through it." They talked for another 40 minutes. When Clara drove back to Blackthorn Ranch, there was an informal agreement in place, not written down but understood. The kind of agreement that works better between practical people when it isn't formalized. She had also, without quite planning it, gathered more information about the Greer brothers and Aldous Hatch than Rhett had ever mentioned to her. Henderson had a way of talking about things that seemed like general information but was actually specific warning. He'd said, "Those three have been buying up land for 3 years. Usually they wait for things to get bad enough that the selling price is almost nothing." He'd said, "Cal Greer, the younger one, he doesn't wait for things to get bad on their own." He'd looked at her when he said that last part, and she'd understood what he wasn't saying. She filed it away. She thought about it on the drive home, and she added it to the picture she was building in her mind. The shape of the problem, where the leverage was, what might happen next. Awesome. The thing about Rhett Callahan was that he was a bad communicator in the specific way that certain self-sufficient people are bad communicators. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he'd spent so long handling things alone that the habit of explaining himself had atrophied. He'd tell her about a problem after he'd already tried to solve it, which meant she was always getting the version of events that had already been filtered through his attempt, rather than the raw situation she could have thought about clearly. She told him this one evening, about 3 weeks in, when he came in from a meeting with the bank in Red Hollow and sat down at the table with the look of a man who'd been having a conversation with himself for hours. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Handled it." "Rhett." She put down what she was doing and looked at him. "Tell me what happened." He told her. The bank had pushed back on the loan extension he'd been counting on. The terms were changing. Higher interest, shorter period, a new collateral requirement that would put the North Pasture at risk. He'd argued. He'd gotten a partial concession, but the situation was worse than it had been a month ago. Clara listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "What's the name of the bank officer?" "Emmett Lyle." "Why?" "Because Emmett Lyle's brother-in-law is Cal Greer." She watched that land. "I found that out from Henderson's wife at the dry goods store last week. She mentioned it in passing." Rhett was very still. "You're saying Lyle is connected to the Greers?" "I'm saying that before you take those new terms as just the bank being difficult, it's worth considering who might be benefiting from them." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality then, not comfortable, but focused. "I should have mentioned Henderson's wife," Clara added. "She's been friendlier to me than most. I've been talking with her." "She's a gossip," Rhett said, but without much force. "She's a well-informed woman in a town that underestimates her." Clara stood up and went to the stove. "People talk to me, Rhett. They don't always realize how much they're telling me." "Why do they talk to you?" She stirred the pot on the stove. "Because they don't think I'm paying attention," she said. "They see what they expect to see, and they underestimate accordingly." She paused. "It's inconvenient in some ways. In others, it's useful." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you think we should do about Lyle?" "We," she noticed. He'd said we. "I think we need to know more about the Greer brothers' finances before we know what our options are," she said. "And I think we need to fix that north well before we lose the cattle drift problem and the Henderson agreement along with it." "The Henderson agreement." He looked at her. "That was your doing." "It was a practical solution. He's been refusing to talk to me for 2 years. He has reasons for that. Some of them are fair." She glanced back at him. "He respects you, though. He just needed a different entry point." Rhett leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. She couldn't categorize it exactly. It wasn't gratitude, or not only that, it was something more complicated. The look of a man who was recalibrating something fundamental. "You didn't tell me you were going to see him," he said. Not accusatory, observational. "I knew you'd overthink it." She turned back to the stove. "I was right, wasn't I?" After a moment, she heard him exhale, something between a sigh and a laugh, short and quiet. "Probably," he said. But outside in the yard, the windmill had stopped stuttering. Danny had oiled it that afternoon, finally, after Clara had mentioned it to Briggs, who had mentioned it to Danny with the particular tone of a man who wanted something done before someone asked him why it hadn't been done sooner. The windmill turned in the evening breeze, smooth and even, and the water ran steadily into the tank below. It was a small thing. A windmill, a water tank, an evening with the light going orange over the flat brown country. But everything ran on small things held together by attention and effort, and not giving up when the easier choice was available. Clara stood at the kitchen window for a moment and watched the windmill turn. Then she went back to the ledger. There was still a lot of work to do. The North well fix took 4 days. Clara had sketched out the filtration method on the back of an old feed invoice. A simple charcoal bed in a wooden box, water routed through it before it reached the cattle trough. It wasn't elegant. The first version leaked at the seam and soaked Danny's boots when he tested it, which he took with the stoic resignation of someone who'd had worse days. The second version held, and by the third day the sulfur smell had dropped enough that the cattle in the North Pasture stopped walking to the fence line and started drinking where they were supposed to. Walt Briggs watched it work for about 10 minutes, then walked back to the barn without saying anything, which, Clara had learned, was his version of impressed. Rhett watched it too, standing a little behind her, arms crossed, with that particular quiet he had when something was working out that he'd privately doubted. He didn't say anything either, but later that evening he came in from the barn and dropped a small bunch of late-season wildflowers on the kitchen table without comment and went to wash his hands. Clara looked at the flowers for a moment. They were scraggly things, half-dried already, the kind of flowers that had no business surviving in this drought. She put them in a jar with some water anyway. It was not a grand gesture. It was also not nothing. The problem was that fixing the well and settling the Henderson situation were the kinds of improvements that took weeks to matter on the ledger, and the ledger's problems operated on a shorter timeline. The bank's new terms from Emmett Lyle had a response deadline of 30 days. Rhett had said very little about it since the evening she'd pointed out Lyle's connection to the Greers, and Clara had learned enough about him by then to know that silence on a subject didn't mean he'd stopped thinking about it. It meant he was thinking about it constantly and hadn't arrived anywhere useful yet. She brought it up on a Sunday morning, which was the one time the ranch allowed something close to stillness. "The bank deadline is in 18 days, she said. Rhett was at the table with his coffee. He'd been out since before dawn checking the South Pasture water levels, and he looked tired in the way he always looked tired, not defeated, just used up and refilling. "I know," he said. "Have you thought about going over Lyle's head to the bank manager directly?" "Silas Prentice." Rhett set down his cup. "He's Owen Greer's age. They came up together. I don't know that going above Lyle gets me anything except an enemy who's higher up." Clara had considered this. "What if you went to a different bank?" "The only other bank that does ranch loans in this region is in Tucson. That's 2 days' travel, and I don't have 2 days." "What if I went?" The look he gave her was complicated. "Clara, I know the ledger better than you do at this point." She said it without apology, because it was true. "I know exactly what terms we can carry and which ones we can't, and I'm better in that kind of conversation than you are." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where someone is looking for a reason to say no, and you have to give them a better reason to say yes." She looked at him steadily. "You get frustrated. You push when you should pull back. I've watched you do it with Briggs." A muscle in his jaw worked. "That's different." "It's the same instinct." She paused. "I'm not saying it's a flaw. I'm saying it works against you in a bank office." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the horses in the near corral was kicking at the fence rail in a bored, rhythmic way that was going to damage it eventually. "The Tucson Bank," he said finally. "It's a longer shot than Lyle, even with the Greer connection." "Maybe, but right now Lyle's terms would have us paying interest we can't cover by February. That's not a loan, that's a slow foreclosure with extra steps." She picked up her coffee. "At least Tucson is an unknown. Unknown is better than a bad certainty." Rhett rubbed his face. He did that when he was working something through, both hands, briefly, like he was trying to reset. "I can't spare the time. We've got the South Pasture water to manage, and Briggs is dealing with a sick horse and—" "I said I would go," Clara said. The silence that followed had a particular quality. She'd said things like this before in the past weeks. Direct statements of intent that left him working out whether he was supposed to argue or trust her, and each time there was this brief recalibration. She watched him do it. "You'd go alone," he said. "I've traveled alone before. 4 days on a stagecoach from Springfield, as you may recall." "That's not the same as—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not worried about the travel." "Then what are you worried about?" He looked at her. "That they won't take you seriously." It landed the way honest things land, not gently. Clara kept her expression level. "That's possible," she said. "It's also possible I know how to handle being underestimated better than you think." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the horse still kicking the fence. "Take Danny with you. He can drive and he knows the road." "All right. And—" He stopped again. "What?" "Take the real ledger. Not just the summary. If they're worth a damn, they'll want to see the actual numbers." Clara nodded. "I was already planning on it." She left for Tucson 2 days later, before sunrise, with Danny driving and the full ledger and her mother's trunk repacked with what she needed. Rhett stood in the yard and watched the wagon go, and she didn't look back because it felt like the kind of moment that got bigger if you let it. The 2 days to Tucson were not comfortable. The road was rough in the way that frontier roads were universally rough, corrugated by wagon wheels in the wet season and baked hard that way by the summer. So every mile was a series of small jolts that accumulated into a full-body weariness by afternoon. Danny talked some, fell quiet some, which suited her. She used the time to organize her argument. She knew the ledger by then the way she'd once known her mother's laundry accounts. Not just the numbers, but the shape of them, where the problems were structural and where they were situational, what could be fixed with management and what needed outside support. The drought was situational. The underlying land was good. The cattle operation was viable if it got through the next 18 months without collapsing under its own debt service. She knew how to say all of that. She'd been saying versions of it to Rhett for weeks. The Tucson Bank was a bigger operation than she'd expected. A solid adobe building on the main street with a painted sign and 2 offices in the back. The manager was a man named Foster Hale, 40, with the specific exhaustion of someone who approved and denied a great many loans and had seen a great many people sit across from him with reasons why their situation was different. He looked at Clara when she walked in, and she watched him arrive at a set of assumptions. She'd become practiced at seeing this happen. It took about 3 seconds, registered her size, her plain clothes, her lack of an accompanying husband, and then the assumptions clicked into place, and his expression settled into the particular professional neutrality that was a front for reduced expectations. "Mrs. Callahan," he said when she introduced herself, "your husband is managing a water crisis on our property and couldn't make the trip." She sat down across from him before being invited to. "I manage our accounts. I brought the ledger." She put it on his desk. He looked at it, then at her. Then he opened it. What happened over the next hour was something Clara would find difficult to describe afterward, because it wasn't dramatic in any visible way. It was a careful, technical conversation about numbers and land and drought conditions and market projections. Hale asked questions. She answered them. He pushed back on certain projections, and she explained her reasoning, calmly, using the specific evidence, the well fix, the Henderson Agreement, the fence line improvements, as evidence of how the operation was being run differently than it had been. At one point he said, "You understand cattle operations well for someone," and stopped himself. "For someone who came from Missouri?" she offered. "I was going to say for someone who's been on the property such a short time." "I pay attention," Clara said, "and I don't assume I know things I don't know, which means I learn them faster." Hale looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he looked back at the ledger. "The terms you're looking for are aggressive. They're terms we can actually service. The terms we're being offered currently are not." She paused. "You can verify Blackthorn's land value independently. The north and south pastures are good land even in drought years. We're not asking you to take an unusual risk. We're asking you to take a fair one." It took another 40 minutes of back and forth and 2 cups of coffee that sat on the desk getting cold while they talked. At the end of it, Hale said he'd need a week to process the application and verify the land valuation. He would send his answer by telegraph. "Thank you for making the trip," he said, when she stood to go. There was something different in his voice than there had been an hour ago, not transformed, just adjusted. "Thank you for looking at the numbers," Clara said. She and Danny made camp that night on the road back, under a sky so full of stars it felt almost aggressive, and she sat by the fire and allowed herself to feel cautiously encouraged for exactly as long as it took her coffee to cool, and then she put it away and went to sleep. The answer came 8 days later, by telegraph. Rhett brought the paper in from town and set it on the table in front of her without a word. The terms were better than Lyle's. Not perfect. There was still a collateral requirement, but survivable. Manageable in a way the ranch hadn't been manageable since before the fever took half the herd 2 years back. Rhett read it twice. Then he said, "How did you do that?" "I showed him real numbers and I didn't waste his time. Lyle's been dealing with our numbers for 2 years. "Lyle has been dealing with you," Claire said. "There's a difference." She said it without particular sharpness, just the flat truth of it. He had reasons to see it a certain way. Hale had no reason, so he looked at what was actually there. Rhett folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood at the kitchen table for a moment, not saying anything, and Clara had the impression he was working through something that didn't have easy words. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "For what?" "For the things I assumed when you got off that stage."
He looked at her. I didn't say them out loud, but I thought them. I thought this was going to be a mistake. It might still be, Clara said. We're not through yet. No, he allowed that. But I stopped thinking that about 3 weeks ago. It was the most he'd said about what was between them since the day she'd arrived. Clara held it for a moment, turned it over, and then did the thing she almost never did. She let herself feel it without qualifying it. The bank question is solved, she said after a moment. The Lyle situation isn't. No. He's going to tell the Greers we went around him, and then they're going to decide what to do about it. Rhett was quiet. I know. So we need to be ready for whatever comes next. He nodded slowly. He was looking at her in a way she'd caught a few times in recent weeks, a way that was part assessment, part something more personal and unguarded that she suspected he didn't intend to show. It made her uncomfortable and not uncomfortable, both at the same time, which she didn't have a clean way to think about. She looked back at the ledger. The South Pasture water levels. Tell me where we are. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, and they bent over the numbers together in the lamplight, and outside the windmill turned steadily in the dark, and the ranch went on being what it was, struggling and imperfect and alive, which was more than it had been, and which, for now, would have to be enough. The telegraph answer from Tucson had been on the desk for 11 days when the first rumor reached Clara. It came from an unlikely direction. Danny mentioned it offhand, the way young people mention things they don't fully understand the weight of. He'd been in town for feed, and the woman at the dry goods counter had said something within his earshot about the Callahan woman and the missing cattle records. He repeated it to Clara that evening with the slightly guilty look of someone who knew the information was going to cause trouble, but felt obligated to pass it along anyway. What exactly did she say? Clara asked. Said there was talk that some of the ranch's cattle numbers had been, he stopped, choosing words, messed with. That the count was off, and somebody knew why. Clara kept her expression neutral. Who was she talking to? Mrs. Rourke from the seamstress shop. They weren't really trying to be quiet about it. She thanked him, and he went to the bunkhouse, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, the lamp burning low, thinking about the particular mechanics of a rumor, how it moved, where it started, what purpose it served for whoever started it. The cattle count she'd done in her first week was accurate. She'd done it herself, pen and paper, cross-referencing against Rhett's existing records and Walt Briggs's separate tally. There had been a discrepancy of 3 head, which she'd traced to a clerical error in Rhett's own record from 2 springs back. 3 calves had been recorded twice during the difficult season when the fever was killing stock, and the records had been kept in crisis mode. She'd corrected it and noted it in the new ledger. That correction, she now understood, had just been turned into something else entirely. She told Rhett the next morning. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He had a habit of jumping ahead in conversations before you'd finished the setup. The fact that he let her finish told her he was taking it seriously. They're saying I falsified the cattle count, Clara said, or that I found something that someone falsified and I'm being framed for it. I haven't heard enough detail yet to know which version they're going with. Who's they? Whoever's talking in that dry goods store. She paused. Who benefits from our cattle numbers looking wrong? Rhett's jaw set in a way she recognized by now. Hatch or the Greers, or both? He pushed back from the table. I need to go into town. And do what? Find out where this is coming from. And then what? She looked at him. This isn't the kind of problem that gets better when you show up angry, which is how you'll show up. Clara Sique, think about it practically. If you go in there defensive, it confirms something is wrong. If I go in as if nothing has happened, it takes away the reaction they're hoping for. He stood at the far side of the kitchen, hands on the counter, looking out the window. She'd learned to read his back as well as his face by this point, the set of his shoulders, the way tension collected between them. He was angry, and he was also, she thought, frightened in the way people are frightened when something is happening that they don't know how to fight. They're going after you specifically, he said. Not an accusation, just something he was working through out loud. Yes. Because you're the thing that's changed here. The bank deal, the well, Henderson. They thought they knew how to handle me. They don't know what to do with you. So they're trying to make you handle me for them, Clara said. Make the scandal bad enough that you cut your losses. Rhett turned from the window. That's not going to happen. I know. She held his gaze. I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about the people in this valley who don't know us well enough to think for themselves about it. The rumor only needs to do enough damage to make our position worse. It doesn't need to be believed completely. He came back to the table and sat down. He was quiet for a moment, doing the thing he did when he was trying to slow down his first instinct to reach something more useful. What do you want to do? I want to find out exactly what they're claiming before we respond to anything, and I want to talk to Tom Henderson. Henderson. He hears things, and he's inclined toward us now, I think. She paused. Also, his wife Ellen talks to half the women in this valley. If the right version of the story gets to Ellen Henderson, it travels. Rhett looked at her with that expression again, the one she still couldn't fully categorize, something between admiration and unease, like he was adjusting to the experience of being with someone who thought several steps ahead and was still getting used to the fact that those steps often led somewhere good. When did you get so good at this? He asked. I grew up being underestimated, she said. You learn to play the board differently when you can't play it straight. The full shape of the conspiracy became clearer over the following week, and it was worse than Clara had initially estimated. The cattle count rumor was only the surface of it. What she pieced together, through Ellen Henderson and a ranch hand named Pete, who had loose connections to the Greer operation and a grievance about back pay, was that Aldous Hatch had spent the better part of 2 months building something more deliberate. He'd gotten to 2 of the seasonal hands who'd worked Blackthorn briefly in the spring, men who'd moved on and had no particular loyalty, and paid them to say that they'd seen Clara altering documents. He'd also, through channels she couldn't fully trace, gotten a letter to the county land office suggesting that the cattle count discrepancy might indicate a broader fraud in Blackthorn's reported land use. That last part was the dangerous one. A land office inquiry could freeze the ranch's ability to operate while it was being investigated. It could take months. And during those months, the bank terms they'd negotiated with Hale in Tucson would be technically in compliance but practically impossible to service if they couldn't move cattle. Clara sat with this information and felt, beneath the careful surface she maintained, a cold and specific anger. Not the hot kind that made you say things or do things you'd regret. The other kind, the kind that had no outlet except forward motion. She'd been a target her whole life in one form or another. She knew what it was to have people decide who she was before she opened her mouth, to have her competence treated as either invisible or suspicious, to exist in a world that found endless ways to tell her she was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. She'd always dealt with it by being better than the assumption, by knowing more, working harder, staying focused on outcomes when other people were performing emotion. She wasn't going to stop now. The problem was that better and harder weren't going to be enough if Hatch got to the land office first. We need documentation, she told Rhett. They were in the kitchen again, which had become their war room by default. Everything we have that shows the cattle count correction was a legitimate fix to a pre-existing error. I have the original record books going back 6 years. I need all of them, and I need Briggs to write out what he remembers about the spring 2 years ago when the fever was bad and the records were being kept under pressure. His own words, signed. Rhett nodded slowly. What are you building? A paper record that's harder to argue with than 2 men who got paid to remember something wrong. She turned to the second ledger, the one she'd started keeping. I've been consistent since I arrived. Every transaction, every count, every adjustment with a note explaining it. If this goes to an inquiry, I want them to see what careful record-keeping looks like and notice that the people making accusations don't have any. And if it goes to the land office anyway? Clara was quiet for a moment. Then we need a lawyer. Rhett made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Lawyers cost money. I know. She met his eyes. It's a last resort, but I want to know who the options are before we need them. He pulled out the old record books from the locked drawer in his office. 4 of them, weathered and warped from years of being handled by men who were more careful about cattle than about paperwork. She went through them that night and the next morning, carefully, noting every entry that touched on the disputed cattle count. She found the original error, found the fever entries where records had been duplicated in the chaos of that spring, found the patterns of a man trying to keep records under impossible circumstances. It was exonerating, clearly, to anyone who looked at it carefully.
The question was whether anyone would look at it carefully, or whether the story would be set by the time anyone got to the facts. Walt Briggs wrote his statement at the kitchen table, slowly, with the particular discomfort of a man unaccustomed to putting things on paper. He kept stopping and asking her if he was saying it right. She told him to just say what he remembered, and what he remembered was clear and specific. The fever spring, the chaos, the double entries he'd noticed himself at the time, but hadn't corrected because there were dying cattle and no hours in the day. "This enough?" he asked when he'd finished. "It helps," she said. "You should know this might get uncomfortable for you. If the Greers or Hatch have people watching, they'll know you wrote this." Briggs looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who displayed a great deal of inner life on his face, but something moved there. "I've been with this ranch 11 years, he said, "before Rhett's father died, and after. I've watched it get smaller piece by piece, and I've watched Rhett try to hold it together and mostly not ask for help, even when he needed it." He pushed back from the table. "I'm not going to let some man from Tucson with a bankroll decide what the truth is." Clara looked at the statement in her hands. "Thank you, Walt." He went back to the barn without ceremony. It was 3 days later that things went wrong in the way that couldn't be recovered from quietly. Clara was out at the east pasture checking on the fence line. The deeper posts had held through 2 rainstorms, which she was cautiously satisfied about, when she heard the horses coming. Not the sound of ranch horses moving at working pace. Something faster, more deliberate. 4 men came through the east gate. She recognized 2 of them. Cal Greer was in front. He was nothing like his brother Owen except in the breadth of the shoulders and the certainty of a man who moved through the world as though it owed him passage. The other familiar face was one of the seasonal hands Pete had told her about, one of the men Hatch had paid. The other 2 she didn't know. She stood in the open pasture with the fence line behind her and waited for them to come to her. Running was not in her instincts and wouldn't have served her anyway. Cal Greer pulled up his horse 10 feet away. He looked down at her with the specific contempt of a man who had decided in advance how he felt and was only here to deliver it. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Mr. Greer. Funny, finding you out here. We were looking for your husband. He's at the barn." She kept her voice flat. "If you'd come to the front gate, you'd have found him." Came the back way. Easier. He glanced at the fence line. "Nice posts. New." "They needed replacing." Cal Greer smiled, and it wasn't a good smile. "You've been making a lot of changes around here." "I manage the ranch accounts. Changes that improve the operation are part of that." Funny thing about those accounts. He dismounted, which she didn't like. It shortened the distance and changed the power dynamic in a way he clearly intended. He was tall, Cal Greer, and he used his height deliberately. "There are people saying those accounts aren't as clean as you'd like everyone to think." "People are saying a lot of things," Clara said. "Saying and proving are different. We've got 2 men willing to testify to what they saw." "You have 2 men who were paid to say they saw something." She looked at him directly. "I have 6 years of record books and a signed statement from Walt Briggs." Something flickered in his expression. She'd surprised him, not by pushing back, but by knowing exactly what his angle was before he played it. He recovered fast, but she'd seen it. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Saying those men were paid." "It's the truth." She held her ground. "And you know it is." The 2 men she didn't know had moved slightly to her left, which she clocked without turning her head. She was aware of how alone she was out here. The fence line, the flat distance back to the barn. Rhett wouldn't know to come looking for a while yet. "I'd suggest," Cal Greer said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more direct, "that you convince your husband to have a realistic conversation with my brother about the ranch's future, before this gets worse. Define worse." "The land office inquiry has been filed," he said. "As of this morning. That's going to complicate your bank arrangement considerably." Clara felt it go through her. The cold drop of something she'd known was coming but hadn't stopped hoping wouldn't. She kept her face still. "That's Hatch's doing." "Mr. Hatch is a businessman with concerns about land fraud in the valley." He spread his hands in a gesture of mock reasonableness. "So are we." "What you are," Clara said, carefully and without raising her voice, "is 3 men who've been trying to buy this land at collapse prices
and have decided to stop waiting for natural causes. She looked at him. You should know that I've been keeping records of this too. Every conversation, every rumor, every piece of it with dates and names, because I knew it was coming and I wanted a clear account of it when it mattered. Cal Greer stared at her. Whatever response he'd planned had not included this. She'd seen the same look on the Tucson banker's face, the adjustment, the recalculation, except this version had an edge of anger in it that Hales hadn't. You're going to lose this, he said. This isn't Missouri. You don't know how things work out here. I know how land fraud works, she said. It's not particular to geography. He stood there for another moment. Then he swung back up onto his horse and looked down at her from that height again, trying to recover the advantage of it. Tell your husband what I said. I'll tell him you came onto our land through the back gate uninvited and made threats about a fraudulent inquiry, Clara said. That's the accurate version. Cal Greer kicked his horse, and the four of them went back the way they'd come. And Clara stood in the east pasture and watched them go until they were through the gate and the sound of hooves faded into the dry afternoon. Then she let out a slow breath. Her hands were steady. That was the thing she noticed. Her hands were absolutely steady, which surprised her a little, because her heart was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The fear had been there the whole time, underneath everything. She just hadn't let it to the surface, because the surface had been needed for something else. She walked back to the ranch. Rhett was at the barn. He took one look at her face, or maybe at something in how she was walking, and put down the harness he was working on and came toward her. What happened? She told him. All of it, in order, because order mattered now. He listened with that particular stillness he had when something was serious, very still, eyes on her face, not interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a count of 5. The inquiry's been filed, he said. As of this morning, according to him. We should assume it's true. That freezes everything. Not immediately, but it complicates the bank arrangement, and it's designed to create enough doubt that... She stopped, organized herself. Rhett, they're not going to stop. The inquiry is the escalation. After this, it'll be something else. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not the expression of a man about to back down, but it was the expression of a man who understood, maybe for the first time fully, how serious this was. What do we do? He asked. Clara had been thinking about it the whole walk back from the east pasture. She'd been thinking about the shape of the problem, the leverage she had, what they could actually do against men with more money and more connections and a head start on the scheme. She had one idea. It was not safe. It was not certain. It was the kind of thing that could save them or finish them, and she didn't know which yet. I need to talk to Tom Henderson tonight, she said, and I need you to find out the name of the best lawyer in Tucson. She looked at him. And I need you to trust me on the next part, even before I've explained it all. Rhett held her gaze. Tell me. I will, but first tell me, how many weeks do we have before the winter route through Miller's Pass closes? He frowned. 7? Maybe 8? Why? Clara looked at the flat brown land around them, the wide sky going orange in the west. The ranch that had been fighting something for so long, it didn't know how to stop. Because I think there's a way to solve everything at once, she said. And it involves going a long way before we come back. The plan came together over 3 days, which wasn't enough time but was all they had. Tom Henderson came to the ranch that same evening, after Clara sent Danny with a note that said only, "Need to talk, important, tonight if possible." Henderson arrived at dusk, tied his horse at the post, and sat at the kitchen table with the look of a man who'd already been thinking about the same things and was relieved someone had finally said them out loud. Clara laid it out for him. The inquiry, Cal Greer's visit, the paid witnesses, the bank arrangement that would unravel if the investigation ran long enough to push them past the first payment cycle. Henderson listened without much expression, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" 2 things. First, can you drive cattle? He looked at her steadily. I've been driving cattle since I was 14. I mean a real drive, hard country, long days, short timeline. She spread the hand-drawn map on the table between them. It was rough, made from memory and from what Briggs had told her about the terrain north and west of the valley. There's a rail depot at Cranston,
230 miles. The pass through Miller's Gap closes in 7 to 8 weeks. If we get there before it closes, we can sell at the Cranston market price, which is better than anything in this region by a significant margin. Henderson looked at the map for a moment. You're talking about moving cattle in the middle of an inquiry. The inquiry only freezes land transactions. We can still move and sell cattle where we're not under any legal restriction yet. But if we wait until the inquiry resolves, we miss the market window. She looked at him. And they know that. I think that's part of the design. Henderson was quiet. Rhett sat across the table and said nothing, which Clara had come to recognize as his way of signaling that she had the room and he was backing her. You said 2 things, Henderson said. Second, your ranch hands. You have 4 men who aren't working anything critical right now. I know because Ellen mentioned it when the hay season ended. She paused. I'd like to hire them for the drive. 6 weeks, fair wages paid at Cranston from the sale proceeds. Henderson looked at Rhett. You're letting her negotiate your cattle drive? She planned it, Rhett said. Seems right. Henderson almost smiled. He looked back at the map. The Faro Creek crossing is going to be a problem if we've had any rain. That canyon runs fast. I know, we route around it here. She traced the alternate line. Adds 2 days but avoids the risk. You've never done this route. No, you have. He looked up at her. Once. 8 years ago. He was quiet for a moment, something working through his expression, the internal calculation of a man deciding whether something was too risky or just risky enough to be worth it. How many head are you moving? 63, Rhett said. Everything that can make the walk. Henderson nodded slowly. I'll bring my 4 men, and I want 10% of the net sale. 8, Clara said. 9. 8.5, and I'll include the alternate water source information I have for the north stretch of the route, which you'll need on the way back if you're doing your own drive next season. Henderson stared at her. Then he looked at Rhett again. Where did you find her? Missouri, Rhett said. They left 5 days later before the sun was up. The herd went out through the north gate, 63 head, which was every animal on Blackthorn that could reasonably make the distance without breaking down. Rhett and Briggs and 2 of the regular hands, plus Henderson's 4 men, plus Danny, who had begged to come with the particular intensity of a 16-year-old who understood this was the kind of thing you talked about for the rest of your life. Clara had let him, on the condition that he did what Briggs told him without argument. Clara rode alongside Rhett at the front of the column for the first hour, while the land was still flat and manageable, and the cattle were fresh enough to move without much argument. The sky went pink, and then orange, and then full morning blue, and the herd moved the way herds moved at the start of a drive. Uncertain, bunchy, requiring constant small corrections at the edges. You should have stayed at the ranch, Rhett said. Not a command, just something he said. I considered it, Clara said. Then I decided the ranch was more defensible with Briggs's wife in it than with me. She's a better shot. This was true. Martha Briggs had arrived unexpectedly the morning of departure, having heard through some channel Clara hadn't traced that the ranch might need watching while Rhett was gone. She was 60 years old, sharp-tongued, and kept a rifle behind the kitchen door with the ease of someone who'd used it before. Clara had been genuinely relieved. That's not why you came, Rhett said. No, she agreed. It's not. She'd come because the drive was her plan, and she wasn't going to send other people into the hard part of it while she stayed somewhere comfortable. That wasn't how she operated. It was probably a flaw of some kind. She'd been told before that her need to be in the middle of things was difficult to manage. She didn't disagree. She just couldn't make herself work any other way. The first 3 days were hard in the ordinary way that cattle drives are hard. Long hours, short rests, the endless task of keeping animals moving in roughly the right direction when their preference was to stop and eat whatever was underfoot. Clara's body, which had never done this particular work before, communicated its objections clearly and loudly by the end of the first day. Every muscle in her legs and back had opinions. She didn't mention it. What she did was watch and learn and pay attention the way she paid attention to everything, in the particular way of a person who knows she can't afford to miss things. She watched how the men worked the edges of the herd, how Henderson and Briggs communicated without much talking, the specific signals that meant a cow was thinking about splitting off before the cow had made the decision. She started to see the patterns in it. By the third day, she could hold a section of the east flank without Henderson having to correct her more than once. On the fourth day, they hit the first problem. It had rained 2 nights before. Not on them, the storm had passed south and they'd only caught the edge of it, but it had been enough to raise the water level in the unnamed creek they needed to cross on the secondary route. The crossing point was a gravel bar that should have been shallow enough for easy passage. Instead, it was running fast, knee-deep on the cattle, with a current that had an ugly lateral pull. Rhett and Henderson stood at the bank and looked at it. "It'll settle in a day," Henderson said. "We don't have a day to spare." Rhett looked up and down the bank. "There's another crossing 2 miles north, but it adds half a day," Henderson said. "At least." Clara came up beside them. She'd been at the back of the herd when the column stopped and had worked her way forward. She looked at the water, then at the bank, then at the crossing. "What's the depth on the far side, after the fast section?" "Shallower," Henderson said, "if you get across the main channel without losing control of the lead animals." She looked at the current. "If we bring the lead cattle in from here," she pointed upstream where the angle of approach would be angled into the current rather than across it. "They're fighting the water's direction less lateral push." Both men looked at where she was pointing. "That might work," Briggs said from behind them. "It also might not," Rhett said. "Yes," Clara agreed, "but losing half a day costs us more than it costs them. We need to try the better approach before we decide it's impossible." It wasn't clean. The first 3 animals went in and 2 of them turned in the current and had to be pushed back and reset. The 4th animal, an older cow that had done enough moving in her life to be practically sensible about it, went across at the upstream angle and made it without drama, and after that the rest of the herd took the social cue and followed. They lost 2 hours and no cattle, which, given what it could have been, felt close enough to a victory. Rhett said nothing directly to her about the crossing after it was done, but that evening at camp he sat beside her, not across from her, beside her, which was its own kind of comment. The problem they didn't see coming came on day 6. 2 riders appeared on the ridge to the southwest in the late afternoon, visible for maybe 20 minutes before they disappeared again. Henderson saw them first and said nothing, which was itself a signal. If he'd thought they were innocent, he'd have mentioned them casually. Clara watched the ridge from the corner of her eye. "Someone's following us." "Maybe," Henderson said. "Greer's men?" "Could be Hatch's. He has riders he uses for things he doesn't want tied to his name directly." Rhett came up from the south flank. "What is it?" "Riders on the ridge. Gone now." Clara looked at him. "We need to think about what they want. They're not going to hit a herd this size directly. Too many men, too much noise. What they can do is get ahead of us." "Miller's Pass," Rhett said, understanding it immediately. "If someone reaches the pass first and holds it—" She didn't finish the sentence. "How far ahead of us is the pass right now?" Rhett asked Henderson. 3 days. Maybe 2.5 if we push." "Those riders have horses and no cattle," Clara said. "They can be there in a day and a half." The camp that night was quiet in the particular way of people holding a lot of private calculation. Clara sat with the map and ran the math several times. The problem wasn't that they couldn't reach the pass. They could. The problem was that you couldn't rush 63 cattle through mountain terrain without losing animals to falls or exhaustion, and losing animals undermined the whole financial logic of the drive. She thought about it for a long time. Then she thought about it from a different direction. "What if we don't try to beat them to the pass?" she said. Rhett looked up from the fire. "What?" "They're expecting us to push hard for the pass. They'll position to block or delay us there." She turned the map. "If we stop pushing and slow down, they'll think we're stalling. Meanwhile, we send 2 riders ahead. Fast, no cattle, different route." She traced it. "Through the Redstone Cut. It's rough terrain, but horses can do it. They get to the pass first. Not to fight, just to be there first, as witnesses." "Witnesses to what?" "To whatever happens when Greer's men try to block a legal cattle drive on open range." She looked at him. "If they actually block us, that's not a civil matter anymore. That's something a territorial marshal cares about." She paused. "If we have 2 reliable men who were there first and saw it happen, we have something." Henderson had been listening from across the fire. "That's a long chain of ifs," he said. Yes, Clara said, but it's better than a foot race we can't win. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then, who are the two riders? Pete, Clara said, and Danny. Danny's 16. Danny is also faster on a horse than anyone here, and he has good eyes, and he'll do what he's told. She looked at Rhett. And nobody's going to expect a boy. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing it, the risk to Danny against the risk of doing nothing. He doesn't go within 100 yards of any trouble, Rhett said finally. He watches, that's all. That's all, Clara agreed. Pete and Danny left before dawn with a letter Clara had spent an hour writing by firelight, addressed to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cranston, laying out the inquiry, the paid witnesses, Cal Greer's visit, and the riders on the ridge. She'd been careful about the language, not accusations without evidence, just a clear, sequential account of events with dates, signed by both Rhett Callahan and Clara Callahan, with Walt Briggs's statement copied out in full. It was the same instinct she'd had from the start. Not power, not money, not the ability to threaten anyone. Documentation. The accurate record, assembled carefully, given to the right person before the other version took hold. The drive pushed on. Day 7 brought a different problem. 3 cows went lame in the rocky stretch before the foothills, which slowed the whole column and meant Rhett was walking sections of the route on foot checking terrain, coming back to the saddle dirty and frustrated and saying very little. The men were tired in the way that showed in small irritabilities, shortened tempers, the kind of fatigue that made minor inconveniences feel significant. Clara kept to the flank work and didn't try to manage moods she couldn't fix. What she could do was make sure the evening meal was something hot, which required creativity with the limited provisions they'd packed, and keep her own exhaustion private enough that it didn't add to the atmosphere. On the night of day 7, Rhett sat beside her again, and this time he said something. I owe you more apologies than the one I gave you. You don't owe me apologies. She was looking at the fire. You owe me honest partnership. That's what we said this was. I haven't always given you that. You've gotten better at it. She glanced at him. So have I. I should have told you about Henderson's wife earlier, and about the Lyle connection the day I found out instead of waiting until it was useful. Why did you wait? She thought about it honestly. Because I was still deciding if I could trust you with things I knew. Rhett was quiet. I trust you now, she said. Simply, without making it into more than what it was. He was quiet for another moment. Then, what happens when we get to Cranston? Best case. Best case? We sell at good market price. We pay the bank's first cycle. We have documentation in front of the marshal's office. And the paid witnesses get examined by someone who isn't connected to the Greers. She paused. The inquiry doesn't just go away, but it gets complicated for them when the counter-evidence is already on record. And worst case? The riders block the pass. We detour, lose more time, miss the best market prices. She looked at the fire. But we still sell. We still make the bank payment. They can drag the inquiry out, but they can't use it to actually take the land unless the fraud claim holds up. And it won't hold up if the counter record is solid. You've been building that counter record since the first week. Since the second day, she said. I started keeping the second ledger the second day. He looked at her. You knew this was coming that early? I knew something was coming. Henderson had already warned me without quite warning me, if you remember what I told you. She paused. And I dealt with enough people who needed me to fail that I recognized the shape of it. Rhett reached out. Not a grand gesture, just his hand over hers for a moment, brief and deliberate. He wasn't a man of easy physical affection. She'd learned that about him, which meant the small gestures landed differently than they might have from someone else. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Day 8, they came through the lower foothills approach, and the pass was visible ahead, the cut through the high rock that would take them to the downslope toward Cranston. Danny and Pete were there, camped at the near side of the pass entrance. 2 other horses were tied at a distance, Greer's men, or hatches, watching from the ridgeline above. Danny rode down to meet them, and his face told the story before he opened his mouth. They were here ahead of us, he said. 2 men. Tried to say there was a land dispute and the pass was closed pending inquiry. He paused.
Pete told them it was open range and we had a witness who'd write down every word they said. They didn't like that. Where are they now? Rhett asked. Still up on the ridge, watching. Danny glanced at Clara. The letter got to the marshal's office. Pete rode all the way in. Deputy came back out with him. He's camped the other side of the pass. Said he'd escort the herd through if there was any interference. Clara let that sit for a moment. She looked up at the ridge. The two figures up there, still and watching. They can't block us, she said quietly. No, Rhett said. They can't. They took the herd through the pass the next morning, through the cut in the high rock with the deputy riding alongside, and Greer's men still watching from above, and 63 cattle moving in the thin, cold air with their breath making small clouds. It was not a triumphant thing. It was grinding and slow, and 3 animals balked at the narrow section and had to be pushed through by hand. But they went through, every one of them, and came out the other side onto the long downslope toward Cranston, with the worst of it behind them. Clara was near the back of the herd when they cleared the pass. She stopped her horse for a moment and looked back through the cut at the 2 riders on the ridgeline above, small and still against the enormous sky. They'd lost. They just hadn't admitted it yet. She turned her horse and went down the slope after the herd, into the wide flat country below, toward the town and the rail depot and the market and everything that still needed to be done. Cranston was a working town, not a pretty one. It had grown up around the rail depot the way towns grow up around useful things, fast, practical, without much concern for aesthetics. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass and lined with the kinds of businesses that served people who needed things rather than people who wanted them. Lumberyard, feed merchant, 2 saloons, a hotel that looked like it had been built in a hurry and expanded twice since. The rail depot sat at the east end of everything, and the cattle pens beside it held maybe 400 head already, bawling in the cold morning air. Clara smelled it before she saw it. The particular dense smell of a lot of cattle in a confined space, mixed with coal smoke from the depot and the general working smell of a town that didn't stop moving. After 9 days on the trail, it hit differently than it would have before. Like arrival, like something finished. They brought the herd into the holding pens in the late morning, every animal accounted for. 63 head in, 63 head into Cranston's receiving pens, which the receiving clerk noted in his ledger with the mild professional approval of someone who saw drives come in short more often than not. Rhett handled the initial sale negotiation, which was how it should be. His name on the ranch, his cattle, his signature on the final bill of sale. But he came back to Clara twice during the process, once to check a number against her memory of the ledger, and once to ask whether the offered price per head was close enough to the projected figure to accept, or whether they should push harder. Push, she said, the second time. We're 40 cents short of the figure that makes the math work cleanly. He might walk. He won't. It's the end of the season and we have 63 healthy animals. She looked at him. Push. He got 32 cents more per head. Not the full 40, but close enough. When he came back with the final number, she did the calculation in her head before he showed her the paper, and she was $3 off, which she considered acceptable given that she'd been awake since before dawn and had trail dust in places she was choosing not to think about. The sale proceeds, after Henderson's 8.5%, and the wages for his 4 men and Pete and Danny, left them with a number that was not abundant but was real, not comfortable, not the end of all problems. Real, which was a different thing, the thing that actually mattered. They paid Danny last, in a moment that nobody made a ceremony of, but that had its own quiet weight to it. He stood at the depot fence with his wages in his hand and looked at them like someone who wasn't sure what to do with the experience of having done a hard thing and come out the other side. You did good work, Clara told him. He looked at the money, then at her, with the specific expression of a 16-year-old trying not to look moved. The Redstone cut was rough, he said. My horse almost went over twice. I know. Thank you for going anyway. He nodded, once, and pocketed the wages and went to find Pete. The marshal's office was on the north end of Cranston's main street, a low adobe building with a territorial flag out front that had faded from red to something closer to rust. Clara went there while Rhett arranged lodging and Henderson negotiated feed for the horses. She went alone, which felt right. This part was hers to deliver. The deputy who'd escorted them through the pass was named Aldridge, and he was already at the office when she arrived.
He was young, maybe 25, with the careful manner of a man who'd learned to take his job seriously by watching what happened when other people didn't. He'd already filed his own account of the attempted pass blockade, which he showed her. It was accurate and specific, which she appreciated. "The letter you sent ahead," Aldridge said. "I forwarded it to Marshal Deering in Red Hollow. He's the one with jurisdiction over the inquiry." He looked at her across the desk. "The paid witness situation is something he can act on if the evidence holds up." "It will hold up," Clara said. "I have the original record books going back 6 years, a signed statement from the foreman, and a corrections log I've maintained since my second day at the ranch." She put the packet on his desk, the copies she'd carried in her saddlebag, protected in oilcloth, for 9 days. "This is a complete duplicate set. The originals are at the ranch." Aldridge opened the oilcloth and looked at what was inside. He went through it with the thoroughness of someone who'd been trained to read documents rather than just look at them. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he asked. "I started building it the second week I was on the ranch," Clara said. "I didn't know exactly what form the trouble would take. I just knew it was coming." Aldridge looked up at her. "Most people in your position would have waited until the trouble arrived and then tried to respond." "Most people in my position," Clara said, "have learned that responding after the fact puts you behind a story that's already been told about you." She paused. "I'd rather write the record first and let them try to argue with it." Aldridge sat back. He had an expression she'd seen a few times before, in the bank in Tucson and in Henderson's yard and in Briggs's face the day he'd handed her his statement. The specific expression of someone encountering a version of a person that doesn't match the category they'd been placed in. She'd stopped finding it satisfying, mostly. But today, tired and trail-worn and still holding the particular tension of 9 days of sustained alertness, she found she didn't mind it. "I'll send this with the morning courier to Red Hollow," Aldridge said, "with my own note attached." He looked at the documents again. "I won't make you promises about outcomes, but this is solid." "That's all I'm asking," Clara said. She stood up, and he stood too, and she extended her hand across the desk. He shook it with the natural ease of someone who didn't have to decide whether it was appropriate, which she also noted. She walked back out into the Cranston afternoon, and the tension she'd been carrying since the morning of Cal Greer's visit to the East Pasture shifted. Not disappeared, but redistributed, the way weight shifts when you set down something heavy. It was still there. The inquiry was still active, the Greers were still out there, Hatch still had money and motivation and connections. None of that had been resolved by one meeting in a marshal's office. But the record existed now in a place they couldn't touch it. That mattered more than anything else. Rhett was waiting outside the hotel. He changed his shirt and washed the trail off his face, and he looked like himself again, or maybe like a version of himself that had been through something and come out the other side slightly different in ways that were hard to specify. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Aldridge is solid," she said. "He'll get the documents to Red Hollow with his own account attached." She looked at him. "It's not finished, but the story they were trying to tell about us is going to have a much harder time surviving the counter record." Rhett nodded. He looked at her for a moment with that expression that she still couldn't fully name, had never been able to name since the first week, since the flowers on the kitchen table. "You're tired," he said. "So are you. I've been on drives before, and I've been doing things I'd never done before for 9 straight days while simultaneously managing a legal threat and trying not to fall off a horse on the Redstone Cut," she said. "Different kinds of tired." He almost smiled. "Come inside," he said. "I got 2 rooms. Figured you'd want your own." "I do," she said. "Thank you." The hotel room was small and the bed was not particularly comfortable, and she slept for 11 hours without moving. What happened over the following 6 weeks happened in layers, the way things resolve when they're complicated. Not all at once, not cleanly, but piece by piece until the shape of the new situation became clear. Marshal Deering in Red Hollow examined the documents Clara had sent through Aldridge. He interviewed the 2 paid witnesses separately, without warning, using the specific inconsistencies in their stories that Clara had noted in her account letter. The details that differed from the actual record, the specific claims that couldn't be true, given the dates. Both men broke under questioning faster than they might have if they'd been paid better, which they hadn't been, because Hatch was the kind of man who assumed that cheap loyalty was still loyalty. One of them named Hatch directly. the other named Cal Greer. The land office inquiry was suspended pending investigation of the evidence that had been used to initiate it. This was not the same as being dropped. These things moved slowly through formal channels, with the deliberate pace of an institution that had no particular incentive to move fast. But suspended meant Blackthorn Ranch could operate, could move cattle, could service the bank arrangement with Foster Hale in Tucson without the threat of a freeze hanging over every transaction. Clara learned this in a telegram from Aldridge that arrived at the ranch 3 weeks after they returned from Cranston. She read it twice, standing in the yard in the cold November morning, and then she went inside and put it on the kitchen table and made coffee. Rhett came in from the barn and read it while she poured. "Suspended," he said. "For now." She sat across from him. "It'll probably be formally dismissed when the investigation of Hatch and Greer runs its course. Deering sounded like a thorough man." "He is," Rhett said. "I went to school with his younger brother. The whole family's thorough." "That's useful information you've had this whole time and didn't mention." "I didn't think of it until now." She looked at him. He looked back. After a moment, she laughed. Not a polished laugh, a real one, the short, surprised kind that happens when something is both frustrating and genuinely funny. Rhett's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. He smiled. Actually smiled, not the almost version he'd been deploying cautiously for weeks, but the real one. A little asymmetric, showing a chipped tooth on the left side that was probably an old horse incident, making him look younger than he was by about a decade. She thought, there it is. The thing that had been present in the room for weeks, and neither of them had looked at directly. She looked at it now. "We should probably have a conversation we've been avoiding," she said. "We've been having conversations the entire time." "About the ranch? About finances? About legal threats?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Not about this." Rhett was quiet. "I'm not good at this kind of conversation," she said. "I want to say that first so you know I'm probably going to say some of it wrong." "I'm not good at it either," he said, in case that wasn't apparent. It was. She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. "I came here with a practical expectation. That's what I told myself. Practical arrangement, build something functional together, and anything else that developed would develop or wouldn't." She paused. "I didn't expect it to develop this fast." Rhett's expression was careful and open at the same time, which she was starting to understand was his version of vulnerable. "What's developed?" "I think you know." "I'd rather you said it." She considered this. It was fair. He'd been saying things, the flowers, the we, the hand on hers at the fire, the way he'd trusted her, the smile just now. And she'd been reading them without responding directly. That wasn't equal partnership. "I'd like this to be a real marriage," she said. "Not the arrangement version, the actual thing." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking for a performance of it. I'm saying that what's already here between us is real to me, and I'd like to stop pretending we're just managing a ranch together." Rhett was quiet for long enough that she felt the familiar old instinct rising, the one that said you've asked for too much again. You've miscalculated the distance between what you have and what you want. She'd spent 30 years learning to live with that instinct, to not let it stop her, but it was still there. Then he said, "I've been a real husband to you in my head for about 6 weeks." She let that land. "I just didn't know if you'd want that," he added, "given everything I said in the letters about this being a practical arrangement." "You also said you were occasionally difficult," she said. "That was accurate. So were you." "I know." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, in the house that sagged on one end and had a windmill that now ran smoothly, and a water tank with a repaired seam and 6 years of honest record books in the desk drawer, and something settled between them that didn't require more words than it had already had. The Greer brothers and Aldous Hatch did not go quietly. That was the part that the stories always leave out, the part where the people who lose don't accept it gracefully, don't step back and acknowledge the outcome and move on. Owen Greer spent 2 months attempting to have Deering's investigation reviewed by a territorial commissioner he had social connections to. Cal Greer made it known in Red Hollow that he considered the whole situation the result of outside interference and corrupt record-keeping, which landed with diminishing effect as more of the actual record became known.
Hatch was the most dangerous in the aftermath. He was not a man who expressed his losses emotionally. He was a man who recalculated and looked for a different angle. He attempted, through Lyle at the bank, to challenge the terms of Blackthorn's Tucson arrangement by claiming the land valuation had been inflated. Foster Hale in Tucson responded to this with a detailed letter to the Territorial Banking Board that referenced Lyle's familial relationship to the Greers and suggested a review of his lending practices. That ended quietly, the way things end when the person pushing them decides the exposure isn't worth it. The formal dismissal of the land office inquiry arrived in a letter in February, on a cold morning when the first real snow of the season was coming down in the slow, serious way that meant it was staying. Clara read it at the kitchen table and then put it in the file she'd been keeping. Not separate, just filed with everything else, because it was part of the record, and the record was how you told the truth about what had happened. She'd started that file on her second day at Blackthorn Ranch, before she fully understood what she was building it against. She'd started it because she'd lived long enough to know that the accurate version of events needed a keeper. That the world was full of stories being told about people who hadn't been given the chance to write their own account first. She thought about that sometimes. About her mother, who had kept the laundry business's books with the same careful attention and never received a word of credit for it. About the women in Springfield who had been written off as background figures in their own lives, quietly keeping the accounting of everything that mattered while the people around them argued about ownership. About the version of Clara Whitmore that Red Hollow had decided on in the 3 seconds she'd spent climbing down from that stagecoach. The version they'd settled on had been wrong, not because they'd looked at her with cruelty, though some of them had, but because they'd looked at her with certainty. They'd thought they already knew what she was, and knowing what something is means you stop looking at it. The thing Clara had learned, across 30 years of being the person everyone thought they already understood, was that certainty is the most expensive mistake a person can make about another person. It costs you the actual truth of them. And the actual truth of people, imperfect, inconvenient, surprising, is the only thing worth knowing. Spring came the way it comes to hard country. Not soft, not gentle, but insistent. The grass came back in the lower pastures first, that particular yellow-green that meant real growth underneath the thin surface. The creek that had run at 1/3 of its normal level through the drought came back to half, then 2/3. It was not a full recovery. Nobody talked about it as one, but it was enough to change the calculations, the way a few degrees of change changes what's possible. The ranch hired 2 permanent hands in March, which was the first time Blackthorn had run a full crew in 3 years. Briggs managed them with the minimal communication and maximum expectation that was his natural management style, and they learned to read him the same way Clara had, by paying attention to what he didn't say. Tom Henderson came by in April. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the spring planting and the water situation and the possibility of a shared fence repair project on the line that ran between their properties. It was a neighbor's visit, ordinary in all the ways that ordinary visits are extraordinary when you remember what preceded them. Before he left, he said to Clara, "Ellen wants to know if you'd come to supper next Friday." "I'd like that," Clara said. "She also wants to know—" He paused, with the expression of a man delivering a message he's slightly embarrassed by. "She wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to the women's group at the church hall about the record-keeping and the bank situation. The inquiry situation, you mean?" "All of it." He looked at her. "There are women in this valley whose husbands have had similar trouble with Hatch or the Greers. Smaller situations. They didn't have what you had." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What I had was a piece of paper and a pen, and the habit of writing things down carefully." She paused. "That's not a special skill. Anyone can do it." "Then maybe tell them that," Henderson said. She went to the church hall on a Friday evening in late April, which was not something she'd have predicted about her life when she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Red Hollow 9 months earlier to the sound of people laughing. There were 11 women in the room, of varying ages, sitting in a rough semicircle in wooden chairs, with the cautious expressions of people who'd been told to expect something and weren't sure whether to believe it. Clara stood at the front of the room and looked at them for a moment before she started talking. She was aware of being looked at, was always aware of it,
had spent her whole life being looked at in ways that reduced her to a set of surfaces. What she noticed now was that these women were looking at her differently than Red Hollow had looked at her in the beginning. Not with admiration, not with warmth exactly, with attention. The kind of attention you give to someone you think might say something useful. She talked for an hour, not about courage or triumph or any of the clean stories that circumstances get turned into afterward. She talked about ledgers and dates and the specific mechanics of keeping a paper record that couldn't be argued with. She talked about what Briggs's statement had meant to the investigation and why a simple account of first-hand memory, signed and dated, carried weight that rumor couldn't match. She talked about going to a bank in Tucson with a real ledger instead of a summary, and showing a stranger the actual numbers and making him do the work of finding a reason to say no. She talked about being underestimated and how it was simultaneously the worst and most useful thing that had ever happened to her, and how she'd stopped trying to fight the assumption and started using the space it created. The women in the room were quiet in the way of people who are listening hard. Afterward, a woman named Ruth Cassidy, 50-ish, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked alongside a husband and never been acknowledged for it, came up to her and said, "My husband's been in a land dispute with Owen Greer for 2 years. We have boxes of old records, but we didn't know they mattered." "They probably do," Clara said. "Can you get them together?" "I think so." "Then bring them to me. I'll look at them." Ruth Cassidy looked at her for a moment with something that Clara didn't know quite what to do with. Gratitude so direct it was almost uncomfortable to receive. She'd spent so much of her life in the position of needing things from other people, of asking for the accommodation or the chance or the basic acknowledgement that she existed and was capable. Having it go the other direction was something she was still learning. She was still learning a lot of things. Rhett was waiting outside when she came out, which she hadn't expected. He'd driven her there and said he'd be back at 9, and it was only 8:30. "Done already?" he asked. "They had questions," she said. "I ran long." He looked at her in the evening light, the particular evening light of late spring on the frontier, low and gold and honest, that didn't flatter anything but showed everything clearly. She didn't know exactly what he saw. She knew what she hoped he saw, and she knew that hoping things still felt unfamiliar to her, still felt like holding something that might break. She'd been holding it carefully for 9 months. "Henderson told me about the records request," Rhett said. "Cassidy's situation. I said I'd look at it." "I know you did." He helped her up to the wagon seat, which she didn't need but accepted. "I've been thinking about something. Tell me." "The ledger system you set up. The documentation approach." He picked up the reins and turned the horse toward home. "There are other small ranches in this valley that have been getting the same treatment from Hatch and the Greers. Henderson mentioned 2 others just this week." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about the same thing." "You have?" "Since Aldridge said what he said in the marshal's office. About most people waiting until trouble arrived." She looked at the road ahead of them. "If the people in this valley had organized records from the start, systematic, consistent, the same approach across multiple properties, it would be much harder for one man with money to run a fraud scheme, because the counter record would already exist everywhere." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about doing this for other people." "I'm talking about teaching other people to do it themselves. There's a difference." She paused. "I can't be the keeper of everyone's records, but I can show people what to keep and why, and how to use it." He looked at her sideways. "When did you start thinking about this?" "Around day 3 on the trail," she said. "I had a lot of time to think." The horse moved at its easy working pace down the road toward Blackthorn Ranch, through the spring dark with the stars coming out above the flat country. Clara looked at the sky and thought about what the next year would look like. The ranch finding its footing, the legal situation fully resolved, the valley slowly adjusting to a different kind of arrangement than the one Hatch and the Greers had been engineering for years. None of it would be simple. Things that mattered weren't simple, but the shape of it was visible from here, which was more than she'd had when she stepped off a stagecoach into a crowd that had already decided who she was. The hardest thing, she thought, had never been any one problem. Not the drought, not the inquiry, not Cal Greer at the east fence, or the creek crossing or the Redstone Cut. The hardest thing had been the accumulated weight of living in a world that kept telling you the story you were in was already finished, that the outcome was determined, that people like you, too big, too plain, too poor, too female, too whatever the current list was, didn't change the ending. She'd never believed that quite. Even at her lowest point, she'd held on to a stubborn and not always rational conviction that outcomes weren't settled until they were settled, and sometimes not even then. That conviction hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from her mother, who'd kept the laundry accounts for 20 years and never once acted as if the business would fail. Who'd said to Clara once, when Clara was about 12 and had come home crying from some cruelty or other, "Pay attention, do the work, keep accurate records." The world has a hard time arguing with a person who knows exactly what the truth is. She'd spent the next 17 years learning what that meant in practice. Blackthorn Ranch came into view on the low rise, the lights in the main house windows making it look like something that belonged there. Which it did, which it had always done, which nobody had ever been able to take from it despite the effort. The windmill turned steadily in the night breeze. The water tank was solid. The porch had new supports as of last month, level and set deep, the way things should have been set all along. Rhett pulled the wagon up in front and they sat there for a moment before either of them got down, the way you sit sometimes when you've arrived somewhere and you want to let the arriving actually register. "I'm glad you came to Red Hollow," he said. "I'm glad you wrote the letter," she said. Neither of them made it into more than what it was. They didn't need to. The truth of it didn't require embellishment. It was just two imperfect people who'd found each other in the middle of a hard situation and decided repeatedly and without fanfare to keep choosing each other. Clara climbed down from the wagon and looked at the ranch and thought, this is what earned things feel like. Not triumphant, not transformed, just real, and hers, and worth every day of the difficult work of getting here. She went inside and the door closed behind her and the windmill turned in the dark.